Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Not So Mainstream. And today I have with me Mr. Oves Anwar, who is the Director of Research at the Research Society of International Law Institute, where he oversees multiple research centers and projects which are related to innovative ways of raising awareness about international law as a subject as well as a practice, especially in Pakistani legal context. And that is what we will be discussing and talking about today. So thank you so much, sir, for joining us today.
I'm very, very happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Right. So, to begin, I want you to tell us a bit about how you became interested in the field of international law as a career option, especially in the context of its developing nature with respect to Pakistani legal context.
That's a very interesting question. So, just to begin with, I'm not a big believer in long-term life plans, to be honest. I take every day as it comes, and when it comes to work or things like that, I do plan day to day and month to month. But these long-term plans, I feel they can be limiting at times, right? So when it came to international law, it wasn't a field that, when I went into law, I said, oh, I want to be an international lawyer, and that's why I'm taking up law. It was something that I think appealed to me. And when I saw it, it immediately resonated with me. And I think that's because of my upbringing. My father was a diplomat. We lived in all around the world growing up. Every 2-3 years, we were in a different country. And so, I always had that global or international outlook, if you will. Then when it came to, specializing, after my LLB, I went to SOAS in London for my LLM, and that was looking at Islamic law, but really it was essentially a course in comparative law of countries in the Middle East, the Muslim world, South Asia, East Asia, and really looking at those blending different legal systems. And that I found something very, very interesting. Immediately after that, I did my second LLM, and this was at the University of Vienna, which was specifically in international legal studies. And by that time, I had pretty much, understood that international law is a field that I want to go into and study more, at least, right? Perhaps it was too early to be thinking of a career in international law at that point, but it was certainly something that really interested me. While I was doing my LLM, I started working for the UN. I was a consultant for the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime in Vienna, and that's where started looking at international or comparative criminal regimes and looked at things on anti-corruption in different countries and how can the United Nations Convention Against Corruption impact states and how can it promote anti-corruption practices and suppress corruption, things like that. So that's really where my first foray into international law began, and it was just something that clicked. While I was studying it, while I was practicing or working in this field, it was just something that because I had exposure in that sense, it just clicked, and it was just something that I knew I wanted to take up as a career. Now, I initially thought that I'd do this working at the UN, but after about 6 months or so, I really wanted to come back to Pakistan, and I wanted to do something for Pakistan. People have this romantic notion of wanting to do something for your country, call it naivety or whatever you will, but it was a strong motivator. So I decided to pack my bags. I just recently got married. My wife isn't Pakistani, and I told her, at the peak of terrorism in 2011, let's move back to Pakistan. So she was very supportive. We came back, and I started studying for my CSS. So I wanted to give the civil service exam in Pakistan. It's a big thing here, as you're well aware. But unfortunately, they didn't let me sit the exam because I hadn't studied my O levels in Pakistan or my grade 9 and 10. So I had to give those extra subjects, and I said, I have 2 masters by now. I'm not giving grade 9 and 10 exams again, right? So exactly. So I couldn't sit for the CSS or like my father, I wanted to join the Foreign Office. So that dream never came about. But I think there is a hidden blessing in failures as well, or in opportunities that you haven't received. And I think that's when me and another one or two of my colleagues, Jamal Aziz, who you're familiar with, we both joined on the same day here at RSI. So the Research Society of International Law, that's where we've been for the last 11, 12 years. And it's really been the area where you wouldn't think it, but it's become this growing area of international law in Pakistan. There's been immense appetite for it. and it's just become, a wonderful place to work. I've now risen up the ranks. I'm now able to, decide what my research focus will be, decide what my team works on, and we work with different international organizations, the government, on very interesting, exciting areas. So it's been very, very fulfilling in that regard.
Great. Two things that I got out of like your journey is that first one is being open-minded about like your journey. So like exploring while you're doing it and then deciding, to choose what you want, which is itself, it's privilege as well as like it's more like freedom. Like, you're deciding on the go. And at the same time, like now you're at a place where you can do independent research and, you can choose what you want to do instead of someone telling you, okay, this is, it's going to be like, so that is, a very good.
Absolutely. I think I'm very cognizant of the fact that, I come from a very privileged background. I have had the opportunities that, many others in Pakistan don't have. Whether it's educational or whether it's upbringing wise or exposure wise. And that's, I think, one reason why coming back to Pakistan was something that was important for me. I think, Pakistan does have an issue with the brain drain, right? We do have our best minds often are leaving, whether they're medical doctors or they're in other fields. And oftentimes you can't blame anyone, right? Because the situation in Pakistan, if you see a better standard of living somewhere, it is understandable that people will want to move there. And I don't blame people. It's just, in my personal situation, I felt that there was a need for me to, leverage my skills to help Pakistan in whatever way I could. And that's really what the focus of my career has been and my work is.
That's great. Right. So next question I want to ask you about your current position at RSIL, being a director of research. How do you foresee while you're working in this area, like how it is developing and how it is gaining more traction within Pakistan and within student community, education and practice together?
So I'll answer this in two ways. One, my role. I'll give you a little bit more information on, as director of research, what do I do? So we're an organization of about 25 to 30 researchers. Where we have offices in. Sorry, I'm just getting a phone. We have offices in Islamabad, Lahore, and Karachi. 3 offices, and we have 3 centers really. One is the Conflict Law Center that looks at law of war, IHL. One is the Center for Criminal Justice Reform. So we look at the link between international law and domestic criminal law, right? And how, Pakistan's obligations to, say, fight terrorism or to improve its anti-money laundering or terrorism financing regime domestically impacts our international obligations. So you must have heard that Pakistan had been grey-listed by the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, right? So a lot of our work went into helping ensure that Pakistan gets off that grey list, and building the capacity of police officers and investigators and different sorts of law enforcement entities in Pakistan. So, that's what that center really does. And then we have a Center for Human Rights, because of course that is a critical area for all developing countries and for all countries in the world, actually. And we've done a lot of research work with the Ministry of Human Rights and with a lot of international organizations as well on documenting Pakistan's state practice on how it fulfills its international obligations under, say, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or ICESR on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, or the United Nations Convention Against Torture, or other such conventions that we have that look at human rights. And so my role is to oversee all of these centers, and it's really to design the programming. What are these centers going to be looking at for the whole year or for the next coming months, and then help the team achieve the targets that we set for them. And it's really a role of providing them the resources, providing them the guidance, and giving them that overall guidance in the sense of day-to-day as well as long-term planning and stuff. So that's what my role is here. Now coming to your question on international law, and where do you see it gaining more traction, say, in Pakistan? We've seen, especially over the last few years, immense interest develop in Pakistan on issues of international law. And there are a number of reasons for this. We can trace the current interest or excitement on international law back to, say, 9/11. and how after 9/11, the UN Security Council and then the United States through the UN Security Council pushed for a lot of counterterrorism international regulation, if you will, right? And the UN Security Council resolutions, Chapter 7, they're binding on all states that are members of the UN, right? So Pakistan had and because Pakistan had terrorists that were operating on its territory, we had a terrorism problem in Pakistan, so we had to take a lot of steps to deal with that. And so it was an international obligation that was dealing with our criminal law domestically and our court structure and our prosecution system and our investigation system. So that's how it came into the local mind frame here. In addition to that, we had the grey listing very recently. Pakistan, thankfully, last October got off the grey list, but it was a 3-4 year process of immense, legal change. And every day on the news, you would hear, the fact if a review is taking place in Pakistan has been retained on the grey list, or it's, something's happened. And we changed, I think, some 22 different laws we amended in this 2-3 year period, which is a huge amount of laws, to be honest, for one specific area. We had regulations passed by the State Bank and by different entities in the country, different regulators, which, if you stack them up, they'd be taller than I am. And I'm not very short. But it's a lot of changes that happened, and this was something that really stuck. And then you had things like India's Balakot airstrikes, for example, and then capture of Abhinandan when Pakistan undertook Operation Swift Retort. So this was cross-border aerial warfare that was taking place. And in addition to that, you also had things like the Kulbhushan Yadav case, which went to the International Court of Justice, and the implications of that Pakistan then had to pass domestic legislation. So because of all of these factors and several others, I think people, especially in the national security domain, the foreign policy circles, are really understanding the value of international law, of how it can be a tool to defend against, say, hostile actions, but also as something to help promote national policies and national priorities. And so that is something that now we see, whether it's in different entities in Pakistan, they're developing that international capacity. I think it's still early stages, but it's critical that we do that. This is, however, somewhat in contrast with the international development. So internationally, we see the global rules-based order somewhat being under threat. Right? You have the biggest example in front of us is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Yeah. Right? A blatant disregard of international laws. This is an act of aggression that's taking place by the Russians against a sovereign state, or Ukraine. And what you also see, however, is that it's not only one bloc that's doing it. You also see Western states weaponizing international law so they can target other their adversaries. So we see unilateral actions being taken, sanctions being imposed, and really. Unilateralism goes against the spirit of international law, which is this multilateral or international framework, global framework, which comes together to harmonize systems, to bring people together, as opposed to creating barriers, right? So to bring down those barriers. And that is something that is worrying. One example of this is that over the last 2 decades, we've had far, far fewer international multilateral treaties being signed by countries, by states, as opposed to the previous, decade or two, where you had, the ICCPR and the ISS, and you had so many international treaties, from the law of the sea to really every single aspect of international relations being covered by some international treaty. And we're seeing a reduction of that. And that is concerning. That is concerning because it makes us less of a, integrated community internationally. So that's really, I think, what the state of international law is.
As you said, that it hits the very essence of international law, like the purpose and the objective that it plays in the international arena. So that's truly that is concerning. So my next question is related to what we, touched upon in the previous answer. So we see all these international events that you also mentioned in your answer, but the general public, they see what they see in the media, right? They don't have any knowledge or context of, what legal things go into any event. And an example is that when I started studying international law in school, I just had a basic introduction to international law, but I was shocked to see there is even a right way to fight a war. in more technical terms, if we define it, it's law of war or the law of armed conflict as we study. So how can this education and awareness can be made like more accessible? Because it's not, getting to the general public, and they have this mindset perceptions about what is happening, and then they make opinions and talk about it as it should not be talked about, or, it's not going to solve anything. So how do you see it becoming more accessible to general public?
No, that's a great question, and I think the one statement that has done more damage to, say, international humanitarian law is that statement that all is fair in love and war, right? That is wrong on both accounts, not in love and not in war, right? So, and that's something that I've had a student, for example, quote me in one of their exams. I said, "Oh my God, I've taught you for so long, and you come up telling me, I mean, all of IHL is exactly this, that the means and methods of warfare are not unlimited, that there are restrictions on how you can fight wars and things like that." But frankly, I don't blame people for not knowing about international law, and there's a very strong reason for this. International law has a high barrier to entry, right? It is difficult to understand. It's not like regular law. At times, it is somewhat counterintuitive, right? It doesn't come naturally, if you will, at least at the initial stages. So I don't blame people. It is a difficult area to get in. If we compare it with, say, a local national legal system, if there is something that is confusing or where there isn't clarity, you can do a case and get clarity from a judge, and that's an authoritative statement on, say, an ambiguous term that's used in a law, right? So you get a clear-cut understanding of what that means, and then in the next case or future cases, that becomes a precedent, and you can then apply that to other cases. We don't really have that in international law. You have the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, right? And that, again, doesn't operate like a regular court. You have to voluntarily submit to it, unlike courts. Like in the Pakistani Supreme Court, I can't just one day say, no, I don't want to show up in front of the court, right? You have to show up. The court you don't have that option. In the ICJ, you kind of have that option, right? You don't have to show up if you don't want to accept the court's jurisdiction. And so really, domestic cases, you have like hundreds of thousands of cases that are pending before these judges. Before the ICJ, I think currently you have 14 or less than 20 cases that are pending before the court. And so you can't get those authoritative views so easily and so quickly. So a lot of international law is conjecture. It's a lot of discussion and debate by academics, through papers that they write, through books that they write, through academic conferences that they have. And that's really where you understand how international law is developing. And you look at state practice, really. And state practice, you have to then try to determine patterns from different acts that states have done. And looking at various different states and then determining their practice. And are they doing that because of a sense of legal obligation? And if they are, then that becomes customary international law, right? So that's a different category. And we don't really have a similar concept in a domestic legal system. So people are more, familiar with, more exposed to domestic legal system. And so it becomes difficult for them to, convert to this international law. It isn't as intuitive as domestic law. And so, but we're trying to do something about this. I mean, RSIL as an entity, we regularly make, explainer videos on issues of international law, where we try to simplify and help people understand a 3-4 minute video to explain these concepts. And we do this through a number of our platforms. We have our own YouTube page. We have a DLP forum, which looks at the law of war and tries to highlight Pakistani scholars and voices, and we also do a lot of explainers on those. And we do this in English, Urdu, and in Pashto. So we're trying to reach a much wider audience through that. People who may not be so conversant in English, even though most of international law is in English, and so making it easier for them to access this. And that's something that we feel very good about. The other issue I think that comes about here is that international law, especially in law schools, unfortunately doesn't receive the kind of importance that it deserves. And we've seen this throughout Pakistan. And even if we're having a resurgence of international law now, this hasn't been the case, and the law schools have not picked up really on this. So we don't have that many international law courses. We don't have that level of scholarship that is being developed. I don't want to get into a debate on Pakistani legal academia here, but it's not in a good place. And international law itself within that community is also a niche field. It's a limited subject. There isn't a lot of interest in it. But then you have to ask yourself, why is this the case, right? International law, the little bit that I've studied of it, you need to have an ecosystem that supports it. Right? An ecosystem means you need to have jobs. And when it comes to public international law, your biggest client or the biggest practitioner of this is the state. So the state has to have jobs for people to get into this, right? So that when you go to university and say, okay, that's the position I want to be legal advisor at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or I want to be a legal advisor at the Ministry of Law looking at matters of international law. You should have a career progression, right? If there's no career progress, how are you going to really, it doesn't make sense going into an area or studying an area, which is not going to help you pay the bills, And so that I think is something that now we're seeing, greater positions opening up, but it's still early days. It's still a work in progress. And another issue with international law is you can't be so in international. You have to be really, really good at international law. And that's a problem, right? Like you have to know your stuff. The margin of error is very, very small because the stakes are so high, right? You're talking about national sovereignty, you're talking about territorial integrity, we're talking about national prestige, and things like war crimes and crimes against humanity. So those are very serious issues. And law generally, you have very small margins of error. But here specifically, I think it's very important that we have that in Pakistan, that understanding.
Right. And I totally agree with you that education and then the career progression, all of these things matter. So altogether, they make up this whole atmosphere where people can flourish in the field, right? So that is really very valid. So moving on to our next question, I saw that one of the missions of RSIL was to utilize the knowledge, research, and practice of international law to solidify the reputation of Pakistan as a responsible member of international community. So it's a two-part question. Why is that important, and what benefit can we get out of it?
No, that's another great question. One of the reasons why we have this is because Pakistan occupies a very unique space in the comity of nations, if you will. We are a nuclear power, nuclear weapon state. We are the only Muslim nation that has a nuclear weapon. We live in a very hostile neighborhood. We know about the Taliban government on one side. We have the Indian government on the other side, which isn't very friendly with Pakistan. Iran is heavily sanctioned by the international community. So we're in a difficult neighborhood. Now, when you have, and then domestically, we have issues of terrorism, we have issues of that, the economy is in very dire straits right now. When you are in these positions, you have to demonstrate that you are responsible and that you can act, especially when you have nuclear weapons as well. That you as a state are not going to be taking crazy decisions, or you're not going to be doing silly things, right? And that's something that really needs to be inculcated in us. Now, perhaps politically, it has seeped in over the years that we are now in a position where we are more of a rational actor in the region, compared to say, some rash actions being taken on our eastern with our eastern neighbor on, say, Jammu and Kashmir, or with Islamophobia issues that are happening there. Or on the other side, you have the Taliban government, which again is a problematic issue for international. They've shut down things like women's education and a whole host of human rights abuses that are taking place there. So in that context, if you were to look at, which country is being somewhat responsible in this difficult situation, Pakistan is now trying to play that role. We're trying to come up with rational policies that we can be proud of, right? Whether it's on the human rights front or on something else. Now, again, steps that are taken domestically impact our reputation, right? So if you are going to arrest the leader of the opposition, for example, or if you're going to suppress freedom of speech or intimidate journalists, that's going to have a reputational impact, right? And you're not going to seem like a responsible state. So what we try to do at RSIL is to show the state that, look, you have voluntarily taken on these international obligations, especially the ones under our international human rights treaties, right, and conventions. Now live up to those expectations, right? You have told the international community that Pakistan signs up and has ratified these treaties. Now live up to those commitments, right? And that's what we're trying to do. So we try to make it easier for the government, and we try to advise them. We try to document how you can really take on these obligations. So whether it was dealing with terrorism, we for the vast portion of my career has been looking at counterterrorism and helping build capacity of our police and our law enforcement entities, our prosecutors and our judges on how to better prosecute and convict terrorist suspects, right? Or whether it's on the human rights front, our Center for Human Rights advises the Ministry of Human Rights, National Commission on Human Rights. We've provided support to them in the past, and we continue to do so going forward. Whether it's issues of climate change, for example, that's a huge issue that is impacting Pakistan with the flooding that took place last year. It's still having an impact, and we're trying to assist really build that capacity gap, as in try to fill that capacity gap that exists, because we sadly don't have the international capacity in Pakistan that the state really needs. So that's really what, when RSIL says that we try to solidify or defend the reputation, or try to develop a reputation of Pakistan as being a responsible member of the international community, that's what we mean by it.
And I totally agree. Like the capacity building of every sector within the state is important in doing that, because as you said, that internally, like if you are taking responsible actions, that's how you portray that, okay, you are you're part of the international community and being responsible. All right, so moving to our last question. This is more again about the field. What do you like to say to someone who is just thinking about taking international law as a specialization, or who is just exploring the field and planning to be in either research or practice for international law? Like, what do you want to say? What's your advice?
So international law, look, I'll be very blunt and honest about it. International law is a difficult field to get into. As I mentioned, it's a high barrier to entry. You need to really break off from, say, the mainstream and really go into this niche area, if you will. And good international lawyers are often deeply passionate about it. They're called geeks or nerds of international law. This is what they dream about when they sleep, right? So it's something that really you have to be driven to pursue. And it is something that can be all-consuming. Like if you become an international lawyer, that is pretty much all you're going to do. As opposed to, say, somebody in general legal practice can do contract law, corporate law, criminal law if they wish. And a full career in Pakistan as a general lawyer, you will probably touch upon all of those subjects, but never have done anything international, right? So that's very, very common, right? Because it is such a niche field. And even international law, I mean, we have to understand the scope. We can say contract law is one field. We can say corporate law is another field, or criminal law is another field. But when it comes to international law is this umbrella term for all of these things at the international level. So there's international criminal law, there's international humanitarian law of war, there's international, private international law, which deals with contracts between, private entities in different countries. So if I wanted to sell a shipment of rice to somebody in the United States, for example, it would be public international. It wouldn't be domestic Pakistani law that applied, right? So it's a vast ocean, international law. There's law of the sea, there's the human rights law, there's a billion other things that you can put into it. And so people very conveniently just say, oh, he just does international law. The reason he just does international law is because there's so much in international law that you kind of have to do. And of course, the stakes, as I mentioned, can be very high. The margin of error is very, very small. You have to really be on your game. And that type of commitment requires, a deep, single-focused approach to it. But having said that, I think it's a great field. It is deeply rewarding. It is some high-impact work. And professionally, for me, for example, it's been, exceptionally rewarding. Again, this is me being cognizant of my privilege and being cognizant of the fact that I am director of this institute and I can, direct where I want the research to go and what I want to do. But having said that, I think it's a wonderful, wonderful field to be in. And I highly recommend people who are passionate enough to get into it to pursue it till the end. because once you cross that barrier, international law is less practice, it's more art, right? And it's this beautiful area where you can express yourself in unique ways, however it's required.
Right. And I totally agree. Like even like reading about it and knowing about its impact, it's a very big task. Like it's also a responsibility at that level to,
And you can make it fun as well. Usually people think when they talk about law, they think it's very boring. But what we've done, like for example, I don't know if you follow our YouTube page or not, but we have a series called IHL in Film. And so we look at war movies, and we look at the international humanitarian law, how it's implemented those movies. So there was a movie with Brad Pitt in it where he hides he has a tank, he makes it look like it's broken, and then when the bad guys come in, he fires from the tank, right? Now, is that lawful under the laws of war or the laws of armed conflict? So we had a discussion on that. So if you or your viewers are interested, please go visit our YouTube page, RSL Pakistan, or the Research Society of International Law. Just Google that, you'll find it. And you'll find all of these interesting, fun ways of engaging with international law as well.
Great. That's amazing. And thank you so much for taking out the time to do this. What I will do is I'll post the links of the YouTube channel and also the website so that people can access all the information and get into more details about it. But thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I really hope that our audience also liked that. And with that, for everyone, I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.